morning, everyone. Thanks for coming in. A little bit of a last minute, but very important event with Alec Russell to have him here to talk about his new book, Bring Me My Machine Gun, the battle for the control of South Africa from Mandela to Zuma. It's a fortuitous time to have an event. It's actually today in South Africa. Their elections will take place, and Zuma is predicted to win those elections fairly steadily. I'm Jamie Zimmerman. I'm Deputy Director of the Global Assets Project, and I'm stepping in for Steve Clemens, who was unable to attend this morning due to being called away on an urgent matter. So I'm glad that you're all here and able to attend. We're also webcasting this event live, and we have a number of viewers online right now. And so, well, it's a bigger audience than it appears to be. Wanted to just provide a couple opening remarks and introduce the author of the book, Alec, this morning. And just to start by saying that last time I was in South Africa was 2005. And it was actually just after Jacob Zuma had been fired as the deputy president under Mbeki of the ANC, under a lot of controversy over corruption charges and rape charges, and at the same time, Mbeki was then, also the subject of a lot of controversy because of some remarks that he had made over AIDS in South Africa, but at the same time he was still seen as quite the intellectual leader of the country. And I was there at that time doing some research on the relationship between trade policy and human rights policy in the country. And we chose South Africa as a country to do this research because it was seen as a paragon of progressivity and political modernity at this intersection of trade and human rights, and within South Africa, but also within the developing world. So it's been very interesting since 2005 to watch the political process unfold and the evolution of the last few years with the election impending and coming to a head today, to see Mbeki now stepping down earlier this year, and Zuma rising sort of up from the ashes and looking like he's going to be taking the helm of the ANC and the presidency of South Africa. So it's my pleasure to introduce Alec Russell in his new book. Most of you probably have seen snippets. He's been doing the book talk and circuit for a while now, a stint on NPR, which I would highly recommend everybody checking out, that reviews the book as well. Alec Russell is the world news editor of the Financial Times and formerly their Johannesburg bureau chief. Previously covered the wars from Yugoslavia and Africa for the Daily Telegraph and was its foreign editor from 2001 to 2003. From 2003 to 2006, he was based in D.C. and covered the Bush administration, I believe, as the Washington bureau chief of the London Telegraph.
That's right. Yep.
That's right. And is the author of 2 other books and is based in London. And I thank you all for coming today. We're really fortunate to have Alec at the last minute to come and talk about his book. This, as I said, this event is being webcast live. When we do the Q&A, we're going to pass around microphones. If you could introduce yourself, speak directly into the microphone. You won't hear yourself through the microphone because of some different AV setup in the room, but it will be transmitting live for our own broadcast. So introduce yourself, ask your question. A couple of us will be around to help moderate. So thank you, Alec.
Thank you very much. Well, I I should just beg your forgiveness very briefly, because at a previous book launch I was at, I was asked to do a book reading. And there was a crowd. I was in London, and so I started reading. After about an hour, there was a not so sotto voce comment from the front row saying when they said book reading, they didn't mean read the whole book. Well, I do actually want to read a little bit of the book, but it won't be the whole book. But I want to read a tiny extract which I think encapsulates what is happening in South Africa right now and and what is climaxing, I suppose, with today's elections, namely this radical change of leadership between two extraordinarily different men. One, Thabo Mbeki, the second post-apartheid president, Nelson Mandela's successor, who saw himself as an intellectual, as a great world statesman, and his effectively his successor was a brief interregnum, but Jacob Zuma, who's cut from a very, very different cloth. And I just want to read this little passage which occurred on a very extraordinary day for me when I spoke to both men on the same day in slightly strange circumstances. I just want to take you to a steamy former British colonial city called Durban on the Indian Ocean coast. And it's the night of Jacob Zuma's 65th birthday. And he's having a huge party. And hundreds of the political and business elite had gathered in a convention centre decorated as a star-filled night sky. And a praise singer called Past Four was roaring a tribute in the background. And in bodice-hugging ball gowns, 5 of Jacob Zuma's daughters were performing a sketch to the tune of Happy Birthday, warbling from a cuckoo clock. We all sang for He's a Jolly Good Fellow. Terrific rendition of it. And as a small army of waiters wheeled in a 2-metre-long birthday cake, there was Jacob Zuma presiding gracefully in a black and gold Nehru suit, the perfect host. Now, this moment was occurring in the height of the battle for control of the ANC between Jacob Zuma and Thabo Mbeki, two former allies who'd worked very closely together in the anti-apartheid struggle, who then worked together in 1999 when Thabo Mbeki succeeded Nelson Mandela as president and eventually made Jacob Zuma his deputy. But since then, their relationship had soured dramatically. And by April 2007, when this birthday party was taking place, they were almost literally at daggers drawn and the party was divided between them. Well, there I was at this birthday party, and I was sitting next to a young management consultant who came from a small village near where Jacob Zuma had grown up, and this management consultant, was in many ways the embodiment of the success of the new South Africa. He'd very humble upbringing, and he sort of had a decent education that he would have found much harder to get under apartheid, and had become a successful management consultant. And he was definitely saluting the talents of both men, because at that stage it would be rash for you to commit yourself openly, certainly to a journalist, to either Thabo Mbeki or Jacob Zuma, unless you were very much in their inner circles. And my mobile phone rang. So I made my apologies, and I opened it up. And a voice said on the other end of the line, "It's Mashlam Bandlovu," which is the president's residence in Pretoria. And moments later, I heard Thabo Mbeki's distinctive, deep, mellifluous voice on the other end of the phone, and he'd just returned from the Sudan. And he said he wanted to send me an email to follow up on a conversation we'd had the previous week when I'd had an interview with him. So we chatted away, and as we chatted away, I thought how extraordinary this was. Even as his enemy was celebrating, surrounded by hundreds of friends, some supplicants, admirers, late on a Saturday night at a terrific kind of knees up, there was the president in his office, I imagined on his own, catching up on his emails after his latest forays in African statesmen. And the contrast pandered to all the stereotypes of the two men, the man of the people, and the more formal, reclusive, professorial president who'd long been mocked by his critics for his supposed penchant for surfing the internet late at night, where he'd been accused of chancing upon slightly cranky opinions, which he then adopted as his own. Well, our conversation ends with Thabo Mbeki saying God moves in mysterious ways, and I couldn't quite hear what that was referring to, because back in the ballroom, the decibels of the band had gone up several notches, and on the prompting of his guests, Jacob Zuma was taken to the dance floor for a solo performance. Most of the stage was occupied by a scarlet uniformed school choir. He inserted himself effortlessly into the front rank, swayed back and forth. It was close to midnight when he finally spoke. He was self-effacing, pleasingly brief. He made a few gentle jokes, and then, after the slightest of rebukes to his political opponents, he stood down, knowing instinctively, like all good hosts of a party, when his audience had had enough. Well, I scuttled out after that and went back to my guest house where I was staying and went online, and sure enough, there was an email from the president. And he'd said he wanted to draw my attention to recent cases of what he said was very inaccurate reporting of his government. And he passed on a very warm and friendly message to my family. I'd just returned to South Africa for a second stint as a correspondent, so he'd done his homework as a good politician, and he knew what my personal circumstances were, and he concluded with a flourish that to understand the media I needed to know a Xhosa expression, and forgive me if I mispronounce it, Alechoni Lingenandaba. This, he explained, could be translated as each day brings its fresh baggage of news. Well, I wrote back that night, vowing to bear it in mind. With hours, back came another email, and by then it was incredibly late. To help me to understand the Xhosa saying, he'd composed a mock news item. This is the president. And here it goes. Last night, while on routine patrol at midnight, a unit of the police service found President Mbeki riding a goat on the grounds of the Union buildings, the government headquarters, stark naked. Scared out of their wits that they might fall victim to witchcraft, the police unit immediately drove away at high speed and smashed their vehicle into the local police station. Miraculously, the two police officers suffered minor cuts. They were, however, admitted into the local intensive care ward, where they were treated throughout the night by the Reverend Sam Nkosi, who specializes in exorcising ghosts and other evil spirits. One might then respond to this news, concluded the president in his email to me, by exclaiming, Alechoni Lingenandaba. This usage would be akin to the meaning that the ancient Romans attached the expression ex Africa semper aliquid novi, open square brackets, Africa always brings something new, close square brackets, exclamation mark, close quotes, yours, Thabo Mbeki. Well, this was vintage Thabo Mbeki. To my mind, it encapsulated this sort of thoughtful, inquisitive, as I said earlier, professorial man who'd been groomed from his youth as a future leader, and yet whose hypersensitivity and whose quest to be an intellectual was to destroy his reputation and to damage South Africa's. It also highlighted the contrast with his ebullient, larger-than-life successor, the man who is going to be elected, barring something extraordinary happening today, in today's elections with a very sizable majority, and will be inaugurated as the next president of South Africa in 2 weeks' time. Quoting Latin is very much not Jacob Zuma's style, as he's the first to admit. In fact, not admit, he's perfectly comfortable with that. And why shouldn't he be? He learnt to read and write only as an adult, and in many ways he appears more comfortable, sitting with poor South Africans just talking about local issues than discussing policy, which was Thabo Mbeki's great gig. Thabo Mbeki, I write, agonized over what it meant to be an authentic African leader. Jacob Zuma had to do no such thing. He was one. He would listen to his people. He understood their concerns, but would not necessarily let the niceties of political convention impede his plans. Well, as I've just said, that's sort of where we are now. And the world is just waking up after many years of paying rather spasmodic attention to South Africa. We will all remember that in the anti-apartheid era, South Africa was the compelling world story. Then in 1994, when it came to an end and Nelson Mandela took over, there was endless attention to Nelson Mandela's presidency and his policy of reconciliation, which caused great wonder and amazement in the rest of the world, given he'd spent 27 years in prison and so on. And then the world slightly switched off. And that, I suppose, you could argue, I don't know what you think, Simon, it was probably in many ways a good thing, and was a sign of how South Africa was doing really, really pretty well. But now the world is refocusing, and one of the reasons they're refocusing is the nature of Jacob Zuma, who is a larger-than-life character. And I've found in the last few days, when giving a series of talks and interviews about South Africa, on a number of occasions, people have asked me, so does this mean South Africa is going to become another Zimbabwe? Jacob Zuma, is this the end of South Africa or something? Well, I'll get on to those questions in a second, because neither of them, I think, are remotely fair. But the point is that South Africa is in the spotlight, that the ruling ANC is in some difficulties now. It has, I think, many members of the ANC itself will concede, lost its way on some of its key issues. So one thing I think I'd like to start by just going back a little bit and just reminding people, before we get on to the woes of the ANC and the weaknesses of Jacob Zuma, we do not just need to put this in context and remember where South Africa's come from. And when I first went to South Africa as a young correspondent in 1993, it was a year before the end of white rule, and there was considerable concern outside South Africa and within South Africa that the transition to majority rule would only happen with huge bloodshed. Now, There were plenty of people who were saying that it wouldn't happen with huge bloodshed, but there were reasonable grounds to fear that the white right wing would throw up considerable obstacles in the way of majority rule. I remember very soon after my arrival meeting up with a man called Peter Botha, whose father was P.W. Botha, the very hardline apartheid leader in the late 80s, and his son Peter was not a politician. He was a sort of part-time farmer and businessman, but he was very close to the right wing, and he had no doubt in his mind that that all the farmers, thousands of white farmers and the right-wingers, were preparing to resist what they saw as the imposition of majority rule. And okay, he was possibly a tiny bit hysterical about this, but there was a huge concern on the white right about the significance of the change and so on. So then I come back. I spend 5 years in South Africa. Then I come back after a decade, or nearly a decade away, in 2007, and the country is a very, very different country, and many things have improved massively for the better. Race relations outwardly, vastly improved. I mean, South Africans here will have a much more nuanced take on that, I'm sure. But I remember being very struck on returning to Johannesburg after not being there for a decade, and how just the day-to-day interchanges between people of different races are just much, much better than they were. Signs, very obvious signs of the economic boom of recent years. This is partly just to do with the global hunger for South Africa's commodities, in particular China's, but also to do with the sensible, orthodox, I would argue the orthodox free market policies that Thabo Mbeki introduced when he was Nelson Mandela's deputy, and then when he was president. And there was nothing inevitable about that. It was a time when there was considerable debate in the ANC, and Thabo Mbeki said, no, this is the way to go. And now you see the road between Johannesburg and Pretoria, the two sort of key cities in the industrial commercial hub of South Africa. 15 years ago, you could go from one city to the other in 35 minutes or so. Now you can never do it in less than an hour. Often it takes 2 hours. There's so much traffic. And most of these new drivers are black drivers, and that wouldn't have been the case 15 years ago. So that points to something else, the growth of a black middle class and so on. So there are all these developments that are happening, and one just has to, I think, put that on the tapestry there before one starts getting into the difficulties, because there are large number of difficulties that South Africa is now facing. This is a very, very important moment for South Africa, and not just for South Africa, for Africa as well, because South Africa's GDP accounts for somewhere between 30 and 40% of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP. So what happens to South Africa matters hugely to the whole region's economy. It also matters symbolically. I think there's this sense that if South Africa works and is a success, then the world has more confidence in sub-Saharan Africa, and also will use South Africa, as it is already, as something of a springboard into the region. But if under Jacob Zuma or one of his successors, the ANC moves down a slightly more turbulent route, and South Africa goes down a slightly more turbulent route, then there'll be all sorts of people shaking their heads, fairly or unfairly, saying, well, why do we need to bother about sub-Saharan Africa for the time being? The truth is that it's not just dear old Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's the sort of moral voice of South Africa as he sees himself, or even some of the opposition leaders who are criticising laying into the ANC. There are plenty of senior members of the ANC itself, which has now been ruling for 15 years, who are starting to speak out and say, well, we've done some good things, done a lot of good things, and the state is stable, but after 15 years, we're ossifying. And we are falling into some of the same routines that all sorts of parties have fallen into after they've been in power for a long time. Now, one should point out that this is nothing peculiar to Africa. All sorts of parties ossify after being in power for too long. The Conservatives in Britain, after being in power for 18 years, by the end of it, they were sort of kicked out as a sort of unruly rabble, practically, and the country said good riddance, and they haven't been back in power since, although they may well return to power tomorrow, re-energized by a long stint in opposition. But there is a trend in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world whereby liberation movements have come in, and that for many years they've been fighting this tough battle against Usually it was against a colonial regime. And then they found on taking power that it's not so easy to govern as it was necessarily to be the standard bearer of a liberation struggle. And not only is it not so easy to govern, but there are all sorts of temptations that appear along the wayside as the years in government pass. And I think that's where we are with the ANC now. I spoke to a man called Cyril Ramaphosa recently, who is one of the most prominent members of the ANC, and he was Thabo Mbeki's rival for the leadership of the ANC back in the mid-90s. And I put to him a line that a senior official in Thabo Mbeki's presidency had said to me, and this official had said, I forget what exactly we're talking about, but after our discussion, he sent me a message saying, what's gone wrong? It's not a dream deferred, and by that he was referring to a famous line from a poem by Langston Hughes, which has now become the title of a very authoritative biography of Mbeki. He said, it's not a dream deferred, it's a dream betrayed. By that, I think he was meaning that Thabo Mbeki had been betrayed by some of his other members of the ANC. And I said that to Mr. Ramaphosa. I said, so is it a dream betrayed? He thought about it. He said, it's not a dream betrayed, it's a dream derailed. Well, you can take that however you want. I mean, I'm slightly encouraged by that, in as much as the phrase derailed implies that you can get a train back on track. But nonetheless, it's a pretty sobering comment for a very, very senior member of a party who's a loyal party man, and himself probably has aspirations still of somehow returning to lead the movement. So looking back at the ANC's record and what they've done and what they haven't done, I think we a lot of this happened under Thabo Mbeki's leadership. Nelson Mandela's leadership was by no means flawless. He wasn't a saint, as he's the first to say, and some of the difficulties that have emerged for the ANC in later years were, I suppose, seeded in the Mandela era. He did have he tolerated weak cabinet ministers who ideally he should have fired. He did little about, in fact, virtually nothing about HIV/AIDS, this sort of terrible blight which is assailing South Africa, which now has more people with AIDS than any other country in the world. But nonetheless, I think it's broadly fair to say that the real problems facing the ANC have started to rear their heads under Thabo Mbeki, and I want to separate them into two categories, really. There's the ones that are sort of, as it were, Thabo Mbeki specific. And by that I'm thinking in particular of the whole saga of HIV/AIDS. And then there are other issues which where the ANC has fallen from the path, and I attribute those more to the culture of the ANC than specifically to Thabo Mbeki himself. I don't want to talk at length about HIV/AIDS. I suspect numbers of you already know the saga all too well. Certainly Simon does. But in essence, Thabo Mbeki questioned or quibbled with the accepted science linking HIV and AIDS, and refused to vigorously lead the country on the subject. And as a result, the health officials dithered, and antiretrovirals weren't introduced until 5 years or so into his presidency, and arguably thousands, tens of thousands, even according to one account, several 100,000 people died who didn't need to die. I mean, an absolute calamity. Now, the ANC don't emerge from this entirely squeaky clean. There are all sorts of senior members of the ANC who knew very well that these policies were absolutely disastrous and just wrong, and they said nothing about it. And I've asked them, numbers of them about it, numbers of cabinet ministers, and they just say, well, it wasn't part of our responsibility. It was, I was in charge of Ministry X or Ministry Y. I'm not in health, so why should I speak out? But that's a bit of a cop-out, frankly. It's cabinet government, and that goes to the heart of one of the weaknesses of the ANC, this belief in sort of utter loyalty to the movement, and you can't speak out and betray it. But that I think it is fair to say, despite the ANC's failure to speak out about it until very, very late, if Thabo Mbeki hadn't been president of South Africa, I think it's pretty likely that there had been different policies. There would still have been a culture of denialism in parts of South Africa, just as there is in large other areas in sub-Saharan Africa. But a different leader, I think, unquestionably wouldn't have taken South Africa down that sort of disastrous path. So that's that. But then I want to park slightly to one side because it's a tragic story sort of unto itself, I think, slightly. And I want to look at just a number of other issues that I spent some time examining when I was there in my most recent stint. I'm thinking of land reform and crime. Crime is the subject which is endlessly written about when people cover South Africa. South Africans sometimes probably fairly bridle and say, why do correspondents only write about crime? It's sort of the correspondents and say, well, it's all the editors want to hear about. Mercifully, the FT has a slightly different approach, but crime is appalling in South Africa. The violence in South Africa is absolutely diabolical, and there are a number of reasons for this, a number of obvious reasons. You can look at the divide between haves and have-nots. You can look at the weakness of the police force, but I don't think either of those actually go to the heart of the saga. There are plenty of other countries with a very, very sharp divide between the wealthy and the poor, which don't have nearly as appalling a problem with crime, and nor do they have the same brutality. And I think you have to look back into the history of apartheid and the sort of brutalization of society and so on. There are all sorts of ghosts that are still out there. But the thing about crime is that in South Africa is that, appalling as it is, there are some initiatives that could be implemented to improve it, and they haven't really happened. Some have. The murder rate has gone down, but it remains an absolute, as I said, sort of diabolical blight on South Africa. And I'm going to return to it in a sec, but I just want to talk about land, because then I'm going to draw these themes together. Land, hugely important. Many of you will have followed the saga in Zimbabwe, where President Mugabe implemented a very controversial expropriation of thousands of commercial farms in 2000, and he very cannily presented it as a redressing of colonialism's wrongs. And while he was certainly right that land ownership under colonialism was fantastically unjust, tragically for Zimbabwe, his measure wasn't motivated by a desire for equity and finally to restore people to their former homes, but it was a crude populist measure to ensure he stayed in power. We can talk about that at more length, but I don't want to go into a Zimbabwean cul-de-sac. South Africa also has a very complex, troubled history of land ownership under apartheid. About 3/4 of the finest agricultural land was in white hands. Obviously, a major problem when the system came to an end. How do you return some of this land to its original owners? How do you create a class of black farmers after most of the original owners, or the ancestors of the original owners, had long since been sort of kicked out to dusty, arid homelands or townships and so on? And how do you achieve that change without, as it were, killing the golden goose, namely destroying South Africa's agriculture? Well, the ANC came up with some very good policies on land. They very carefully eschewed the more populist approach taken by Zimbabwe, and came up with policies of land distribution and land restitution and land reform. And that was excellent. And over the early years of Mbeki's presidency in particular, when the process really got going, large numbers of former owners of land had their lands restored to them. And there was jubilation and celebration and so on. But, and here's the rub, in the vast majority of those cases, the happy story ends there, because all too often, these people have just been told, here's your land, and then just left to get on with it. Well, I know for a fact that if I were handed over, if I were given a farm, and with sophisticated agricultural machinery, crops to harvest, orchards or whatever, it would be an absolute disaster if I didn't have someone to tell me how to run it. It would be a complete catastrophe. And I went to a farm in the Free State several times, and the new farm owners were just beside themselves. They were absolutely despairing. They'd been there for 4 or 5 years. They kept going to the local provincial government and saying, help us. We need someone to come and show us what to do. And people in the local provincial government say, we're going to come and show you. We'll go back to your farm. Don't worry, someone will come. And then no one came. And in this one particular farm, they'd been something like every 6 months. And every time they got the same response. And then they even went to a neighbouring provincial government. South Africa's divided into 9 separate provinces. But they were left. And that story, sadly, has been repeated across the country. So far too many of these land reform projects have ended disastrously. And this one I'm talking about is now effectively at an end. Most of the people that returned to work the farm have gone back to a little small town, living in a township, living in a small township shack, trying to eke out an existence. A few of them have stayed behind and are chopping down the fruit trees from the orchards for firewood. There's nothing there. They didn't, they needed people to tell them how to make all the, to service the tractors and so on. And it's been hopeless. And this goes, I think, to the heart of one of the problems that the ANC faces, or two of the problems that the ANC faces. One of them is, to use a kind of rather dull, jargonistic word, capacity, a shortage of skilled people in the party and in local and provincial government to implement these policies, and that is a real disaster. And the other is just a sort of endemic saga within the ANC of its sort of inability to translate its grand dreams into reality on the ground, and this is Zuma's great challenge as he prepares to take over. The party is, to be a little bit harsh, is all too often even sort of something of a dead hand. Government initiatives just, by and large, with the exception of the finance ministry, which is terrifically successful in my view, are something of a dead hand. And when you do come across successful initiatives, as I came across a very successful land reform initiative, they tend to be where private enterprise has got together with a local community and just worked out a viable project. So there's one I saw relatively recently where a community that had been kicked off their land 30 years ago returned to their land, looked around themselves, thought, yikes, how are we going to make a go of this? There is no means of supporting our families. Then they got together with a Afrikaner farmer whose farm had literally dried up in a drought, and he was looking for work, and he became their farm manager. And they're now running a very successful berry enterprise, which aspires to employ 300 people and be South Africa's most successful berry farm. Well, that's a terrific story, but it's actually nothing to do with the ANC at all. And similarly, back to crime, the reason I mentioned crime, I came across some very successful community policing initiatives. And the ANC is now belatedly talking about community policing as the way to go, but this particular community policing initiative had nothing to do with the government at all, or indeed really with the police. This was just two communities. This was a former white suburb and a former black township coming together, patrolling, and crime levels went down dramatically. But those sorts of initiatives are still something of an exception. So how can Zuma change this? Will he change this? Well, I spent a certain amount of time with Jacob Zuma. I sat next to him at a dinner last year and talked at length about all of these problems. I have to say, one-on-one, he gave an immensely reassuring message. He's very calm and sensible in all his policy pronouncements. When you speak to him, he doesn't claim to have any great searing insights about policy. He says that's not really his thing. We talked about land, and he talked about the need to re-energize it. And when someone else in the discussion suggested a more radical policy, he just sort of laughed the guy out of court and said, "Don't be ridiculous. That's not the way to go." He's very empathetic about crime. In fact, he told me a very engaging anecdote about how he'd been mugged in central Johannesburg. Well, that's a sort of story that will delight South Africans, that they have a leader that understands what they suffer, who understands how appalling crime is. And he talked very sensibly about Zimbabwe. He was slightly guarded in what he said, but nonetheless, by the standards of global leaders, his comments on Robert Mugabe were fantastically trenchant, and he was sort of laughing about some recent conversations he'd had with Mugabe and how Mugabe kept saying to him, but Jacob, I thought just the other day I'd lined up a successor, and then I just thought, no, he's not quite experienced enough, so I think I need to stay on another 6 months, but I'll get back to you, and I'll come up with someone else. Well, this is just the sort of message that the world wants to hear. As I said earlier, the ANC's been in power for 15 years. It clearly needs a bit of a re-energization, and these sorts of signals from Jacob Zuma are very encouraging. But there are, of course, as many of you will know, having read some of the coverage and so on, there are difficulties with the whole Zuma revolution and so on. He is fantastically popular, and he has fired up his supporters, and will probably get a very sizable majority. It'll be very interesting to see if he manages to equal Thabo Mbeki's majority of about 69% last time. One would think that's unlikely, given there's a new splinter opposition group that broke away from the ANC, but I don't think you can completely rule it out. He really has sort of revved up the party's support base, and there are incredibly high expectations. I've spoken to all sorts of people who refer to him as a messiah. He's the man who's going to transform our lives and so on. Well, it's not that easy to transform the lives of millions of people in South Africa. There is no magic solution to nearly 40% unemployment, and particularly at this difficult time for the global economy. So this is issue number one. He has encouraged colossal expectations. Well, some people will say to me, but Alec, journalists were talking about colossal expectations back in 1994 and saying, hasn't the ANC promised far too much, and aren't people going to be disappointed? Well, some journalists were writing that then. Maybe I was too. And maybe we were a bit over the top, in as much as most South Africans have been remarkably patient. But it is now 15 years on, and I think there is a sense among many South Africans that not as much has changed and not as quickly as they might have hoped, and that some of the more obvious signs of change are manifested in the sort of personalities of all sorts of incredibly successful business people, several hundred of whom have made vast sums of money primarily by dint of their relationship with the ruling party, and not as a result of their great business acumen. So if you're sitting in a shack, you have a pretty good sense of what is going on, and you're wondering, well, what is going to change? So now there are these huge expectations, and can he pull them off? And if he doesn't, what's going to happen? Well, I know I've said that his policy statements are very reassuring, but many in his entourage, or numbers in his entourage, are pretty unimpressive. And not only the unimpressive, but many of them clearly are taking power because they're seeking revenge on Thabo Mbeki's clique. And some of them openly tell me that they're frankly looking for their turn at the high table to get some juicy business deals. So it is a very, very critical moment for South Africa right now. It is. I posit three scenarios in my book for the Zuma presidency, and I think there is a chance, if South Africa's lucky, that he could even be something of a Ronald Reagan figure, as I put it, that he will allow the country to take a deep breath and recover from this awkward time under Thabo Mbeki, this would-be professor who was asking very awkward questions of South Africa and led it, as a result, into all sorts of blind alleys, as it were, from which it's not easily going to emerge, and that it's just possible if Jacob Zuma does exactly what he says he's going to do and stays in power for 5 years and makes people just feel that he's listening to them. As he unquestionably will be, he will be more of a president for all South Africans than Thabo Mbeki was. Thabo Mbeki very pointedly renounced the reconciliatory ethos of Mandela's presidency and said it was time to be to focus on the transformation of South Africa, to focus on transforming black South Africans' lives, and white people just had to muck in or indeed practically leave. Well, when he took power, I think a lot of people who thought that was a very good plan. I remember I was a huge fan of Thabo Mbeki's and wrote lots of supportive articles about why South Africa needed a more rigorous leader. But his prickliness, particularly on issues of race, served South Africa, I think, poorly, and encouraged the numbers of white professionals to go into exile, or not into exile, but to go and live overseas. And these are the sort of people that South Africa badly needs. So if you get in a man like Jacob Zuma who's saying, here we go, South Africa is for people of all races, then obviously that's good news. So that's scenario number one. To sort of lurch in the other direction, the other scenario, or another scenario, is that he's just frankly not up to the job, and that he struggles to keep the place on track, and that he lurches more into populism, that there's an increase in crony capitalism, that the ANC continues to follow two very, should I say, unhelpful trends. One of them is just the focus on self-enrichment, and the other is a drive to blur the divide between party and state. And I actually spoke to the Dalai Lama about this a few weeks ago, and I was in Delhi, and I said, so what did he think was happening in South Africa? And he said, look, because he knows Desmond Tutu incredibly well, and he said, what upsets him is how many people in the ANC have lost sight of their ideals and focused on money and power. And then there's the middle phase, which is that the country sort of muddles along, and that's probably the more likely scenario. That even if if we take Jacob Zuma at face value and say that he really wants to do what he says he wants to do, that he just can't really pull it off. That he struggles to keep the ANC together. That he struggles to lead, to persuade people to follow his direction, because he himself has such a controversial past. He's got all these corruption allegations that have been hanging over his head for so long. Then there's the messy saga of his trial for rape a few years ago, and that he lacks credibility as a leader, both for South Africa on the international stage and for the ANC and South Africa within South Africa, and that while there's not a radical shift in any particular direction, there's something of an emptiness, and I think that's the scenario that we have to watch for, I suppose. I think that the outbreak of populism is of radical populism and a sort of completely hopeless presidency is pretty unlikely. But I fear that the Reagan scenario is not. Maybe a little bit optimistic. I'd like to think I'm wrong. And the final thing I think I should just say, just in terms of Zuma, just to bear in mind, is that he talks a good game. But as we saw with the Dalai Lama recently, the Dalai Lama was denied a visa to South Africa, very controversially, and I think before that happened, everyone had assumed that South Africa's slightly, occasionally quirky foreign policy was a Thabo Mbeki initiative. And then we find the Dalai Lama's having his visa application rejected. Well, yes, all countries pursue realpolitik, but that, to my mind, was a sort of pretty craven acquiescence to China, and it did, I gather, come straight from Jacob Zuma's office. He said, no, look, there's a Beijing wants X or Y, and so no visa. So I think we have to hope. Anyway, I'll stop there, and delighted to take any questions. And books on sale in all great bookshops in South Africa and America and the UK. Thank you very much. I might get some water.
All right, thank you, Alec, and everybody. It's really interesting. I'm going to go ahead and pose a first question since I kind of get that privilege here. And I like hearing your range of scenarios for how this the presidency of Zuma could play out, and what that means within South Africa. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your prediction for what that means outside of South Africa and the view of South Africa, though this has dwindled in recent years, but as the leader of the African continent and as a leader of developing countries, how does a Zuma presidency impact that? What's your prediction on the foreign policy and even international development policy realm? I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that.
That's very interesting. Well, Thabo Mbeki, one of his great strengths was that he was very impressive on the world stage. And until the world started to question his policies on AIDS and think, hang on a moment, this man has a serious flaw, he put his best foot forward and acted as a very, very good ambassador for South Africa and indeed for Africa. So he pushes Africa onto the world agenda at G8 meetings. He talks very knowledgeably and learnedly about global trade, the global economy. So one might think a pretty hard act to follow internationally. Zuma will consciously eschew trying to be to do the same thing. He's going to play up the line. Look, I'm not a great policy expert. I'm just a politician, and here are my technocrats and so on. I don't think we really know, actually. Simon may have a better idea of this than I. I just don't think we know what sort of figure Jacob Zuma is going to cut on the world stage, how he's going to play the rest of the continent. I mean, the most obvious policy area that I suppose we think we know something about is Zimbabwe, that he's been more outspoken on Zimbabwe. But will he actually radically change policy on Zimbabwe? I think probably not, actually. I think he talked a good game, in particular soon after, when I say talked a good game, as in he was quite critical of Robert Mugabe, quite soon after Jacob Zuma, was elected leader of the ANC, because he desperately needed to reassure the rest of the world that he wasn't some sort of scary populist, and that he was a leader they could do business with, and that South Africa was going to move in the right direction. But my guess is that now he's in power, that South Africa may again shrink from actually being particularly confrontational towards Mugabe. The other complication, of course, is that no one knows what to do with Zimbabwe right now, because you've got this coalition government, and so you've got Mugabe there, you've got Morgan Tsvangirai, the prime minister, the opposition leader there, and there's a sort of no one, as I said, no one is sure how to push Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's government is not doing anything especially repressive at the moment, beyond the fact that it's always pretty repressive, if you see what I mean, but it's not beating up lots more people at the moment, so it's out of the news. I think Zuma will retreat on Zimbabwe. That's just a prediction.
Great, thanks. Well, we have a few minutes left, so we can open it up to questions. Please introduce yourself and speak directly into the microphone. So let's get started. Anyone want to start?
Thank you very much. I'm Manilis Duas with the SABC here in Washington. Thank you very much, Alec. I wish you could I didn't read it. I've read some extracts from lady, maybe you might know Ariel Havaji on the Mail and Guardian.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
No,
she was quite positive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
read that review.
I did read the review,
Yeah.
but I'm looking forward to
bless you.
grabbing the book
Yeah.
itself.
Well, make sure SAB pays for it. So it's crucial research.
Yeah. But let me just ask you. Let me just first just generally ask you something which is not related to your book. As you know that South Africans are voting today.
Yeah.
I mean, you have observed the 1994 election, I suppose, and you have observed the political situation in South Africa, the elections. I just want your comment or your observation on what do you expect of today. Is free and fair elections something which some African countries can learn from? Or,
well, look, I'd say a couple of things. One, it is a very, very important election. This one, clearly, it's the most important election since the 1994 election, and for several reasons. Point number one, there is this new opposition formation, and it'll be very interesting to see how they do. This is that splinter movement that broke away from the ANC. So I think the world will be looking very closely to see how the opposition parties do, whether they are opposing a sort of serious opposition to the ANC, whether this is the dawn of a new era of competitive politics or not. I think it's not the dawn of a new era of competitive politics yet. I think the ANC will continue to get a sort of huge 2/3-ish majority. But that's one reason that the world is focusing on it hugely. And the other reason is to see what happens next. Today itself is almost of less importance for the international community and international investors and business people who speak to me at the Financial Times than what happens in the next few weeks. There's huge interest in the nature of Jacob Zuma's cabinet. That is the real question, the real issue that's exercising the rest of the world. What will happen to Trevor Manuel, the finance minister of the last decade? What role will he play? And who will hold down some of the other key positions? There's speculation that someone like Tokyo Sukwali may play a role in the government. That'll be closely watched. He's a figure that people know abroad, very successful businessman, and that would send, I think, a reassuring signal probably that the government, despite Jacob Zuma's close links with the unions and the left, is broadly going to maintain the same policy. So, no, this election is being watched very closely. In terms of the question about free and fair elections, I'm sure it'll be a perfectly free and fair election.
And then my question, now is that, I mean, you raised the issue of high expectation. Of course, there are high expectation, and he's partly responsible for those expectations. He raised them. Even his allies who branded him as a pro-poor president, as if others were not pro-poor. Was it a blunder, really, to raise such expectations when they were seeing that there is this global economic meltdown? I mean, as far as we are concerned. I mean, I see it as a blunder, but because, you can't raise expectations at this time when the whole world talk about losing jobs, that the economy in South Africa, the expectations are that it might grow by only a percentage point.
Jacob Zuma has recently been frantically trying to downplay expectations. I think he realizes that he and his allies went too far in the opposite direction. I think it was a mistake. I understand why they did it. It's an obvious political move, isn't it? You promise lots of stuff and everyone rallies to your flag and supports you. But I think there is considerable concern in some quarters in the NC that they have overblown expectations, and then people will be disappointed. I mean, I've spoken to a veteran township activist outside Johannesburg in Orange Farm, a former squatter camp outside Johannesburg, and he was fantastically dismissive of all these promises, and he just said, Jacob Zuma's come and promised all this stuff, and it'll be absolutely no different, and in a few years' time, no one will be singing his signature anthem, Bring Me My Machine Gun, that former anti-apartheid hymn, and it'll just be in the dustbin of history. I think we just have to hope that this activist friend of mine is wrong.
Jim Hostetler. I'm an attorney in Washington. I've just returned from South Africa.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And given the history of contentious and controversial issues on corruption and his personal life, what do you anticipate or see he can do to restore some sense of respect for the rule of law, of an independent judiciary, of a system of checks and balances, as opposed to the trend that seems to be underway of simply single-party power, and where many people are very skeptical about his willingness to accept decisions about his cabinet or his personal administration that will be controversial and critical?
Well, I think it's a very good point. I should really have raised this in my talk, but there's a lot to say. It's a pretty depressing saga, really. The whole story of Jacob Zuma and the courts and the role that his supporters have been playing in assailing the reputation of the judiciary. I mean, I think you have to understand that the whole saga of the attacks on the independence of the judiciary, and the possible undermining of the judiciary's independence, arguably did begin under Thabo Mbeki. So it's not as if this is a new phenomenon. One of the trends of Thabo Mbeki's government was to deploy cadres, as the ANC puts it, into key positions, and the prosecution service did face intermittent political pressure. That said, for Jacob Zuma's allies to suggest, as they do, that these corruption allegations are all trumped up and a political maneuver by Thabo Mbeki is preposterous. There are serious questions that Jacob Zuma was facing, that he appeared was going to have to answer in court, relating to, as we all know, the conviction of his former financial advisor for corruption and fraud. Among his offences was procuring a bribe for Jacob Zuma from a French arms company. Mr. Zuma says that he wasn't privy to that arrangement, didn't know about it. But it's very clear that there are very serious allegations out there that he needed to address. They have now fallen away because the prosecution service has withdrawn the charges. And it does leave, I think, a sour taste in many people's mouths. I think they're left thinking, well, fantastically convenient that these charges just disappeared 10 days before the election, and allowing Jacob Zuma to take office without the threat of prosecution hanging over his head. I have to say I wasn't especially surprised. I always assumed that the case would disappear, would wither. It was just a question of how it was going to happen. And there was endless debate within Jacob Zuma's camp in the last 18 months as to what policy they should pursue, whether they should think of getting their man into office and then bringing in what was known as the sort of Berlusconi option, a kind of an immunity from prosecution, or whether the prosecution service might, as it happened, drop the charges. Or whether the sort of last case scenario was a much more full-on attack on the judiciary and just intimidate the judiciary. So I think you could argue that given the impulse that was dominating Jacob Zuma and his circle, that what has happened has caused least damage possibly to South Africa's reputation, in as much as there is no concrete proof that the prosecution service, that the head of the prosecution service was just doing the bidding of the ANC and Jacob Zuma. But of course, it was the charges were withdrawn on something of a technicality. It was a pretty flimsy reason cited. Yes, it does appear that the head of the investigative unit of the prosecution service was discussing with a senior member of the ANC the timing of the charges. Not entirely a satisfactory turn of events, but for that to lead to the dropping of the whole case is pretty poor. So what's Zuma going to do? I think it's a it's a hugely important issue. This once you tamper with the independence of the judiciary, you don't go back. If you undermine such a foundation, it never gets rebuilt. I mean, at least I can't think of a case. There are some cases where in some other countries in sub-Saharan Africa where the independent institutions that which they were on gaining independence rapidly were undermined, and now they're being slowly rebuilt, but an incredibly long process after years of tears. So it's fundamentally important that the judiciary does maintain its independence. I mean, I think one thing is if Jacob Zuma and his allies do make a serious push for one reason or another, if they think the charges are coming back and they really try and intimidate judges and so on, it will cause one hell of an outcry. It won't happen easily. South Africa has a very strong and vibrant media and civil society, and so it won't happen without a major fight.
Okay, let's take one or two more questions. Anybody else have something? Okay, if not, then we can close the webcast portion. If people would like to stick around for a few minutes and speak with Alec offline about the book or whatever other issue, I'm sure he'll be pleased to stay around and chat. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you very much.